Well, good afternoon and welcome. My name is Peggy Lowe, and I'm the president of the Episcopal Parish Network. I'm the president of the board for the Episcopal Parish Network. Thank you all for joining us for this conversation about crisis communications with the EPN members, St. Michael and All Angels, and Sunwest Communications. We're pleased to present this program and invite you to learn more about our work at episcopalparishes.org. We also just opened up early bird registration for our 40th annual conference in Kansas City next February, from February 25th to 28th. So hope you'll register and that we'll see you there. And we ask you to introduce yourselves in the comments, and also post your questions in the comments so that the panel will be able to see and answer them. So Crayton, I will hand it off to you.
Very good. Thank you so much, Peggy. Nice to see you all. Thank you all for making time on a Thursday afternoon. My name's Crayton Webb. I'm the owner and CEO of Sunwest Communications in Dallas, Texas. I'm a recovering television news reporter and was in politics for a while, and then had a corporate job. I'm also a member of the Church of the Incarnation in Dallas, Texas, and I'm really pleased to be joined by my friend, and as it turns out, my neighbor, who is the rector of one of the largest, if not the largest, Episcopal congregations and parishes in the state of Texas, St. Michael and All Angels. I'm joined today by Reverend Dr. Chris Girata. Of course, many of you know Father Chris and his many accomplishments. He holds degrees from Stetson, Emory, and the Virginia Theological Seminary, and a doctorate from Duke. He's well known in Episcopal communities all across the country. He's from Florida, has 3 wonderful children, and as I said, in the past, he's been my client. He is my neighbor, and most importantly, he's my friend. So in a moment, we're going to talk a little bit about more what there is to talk about, which is a lot here, about a week and a half from Election Day. We live in tumultuous times, to say the least, where any brand, whether it's public, private, or theological in nature, has a reputation to protect externally, but also internally. But before we go a minute further, let me hand it over to Father Chris, who I might ask to start us out today with a word of prayer.
Thank you, Crayton. It's a pleasure to be with you too, and nice to have you all joining us. Let's open with a prayer so that we get ourselves centered. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, we give you thanks for the beauty of this day and the gift of life and love, and we ask that you be with each of us to open our hearts and minds, that we can set down for the next hour anything that is weighing on us, causing us stress or anxiety, that we can be open to your Spirit in the way that you would move within us to help to carry your light out into the world. Be with those that we hold in our hearts, especially those who need your healing touch today. May they feel the power of our prayers and of your presence. Gift us in this time that we can be inspired to work continuously toward the transformation of this world, that it reflect your kingdom here on earth. All of this we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. So as Peggy said, we have an hour with you all. And let me tell you, between Father Chris and I, we could take 2. So our format today is rather simple, and that is we're going to have a conversation. I'm going to ask him questions, and he's going to ask me questions. And we love to chat with one another, so don't be surprised if it appears that we're just having a conversation, because that's exactly what we're going to do. But we're hopeful that, considering the topics at hand and the serious nature of reputation in the world we live in, that there is some benefit to you and your parish, the people who work for you or with you, around you, and as you guide one another in navigating through these difficult times. We also, as Peggy mentioned, want to give you an opportunity to ask questions. And so if you have questions, if you will just put those in the chat, and we will do our best to monitor those. Depending on how things go, we might take a break in between our conversations and jump to the chat to take a question from one of you, or we might wait to the end. So we'll just see how it goes. So let's go ahead and begin. As I said, election about a week and a half away. Some of you, if you're clergy, may have chosen to preach about politics from the pulpit. Many of you may have decided to do the exact opposite. There have also, at least in Texas, been a myriad stories of, not necessarily from the Episcopal faith, but of scandals, if you will, regarding church leadership. at churches across Texas and in other places across the nation, and this is not new. But we do live in a new society where in the digital age, news or rumors or innuendo travel quickly. And so for any congregation or group of individuals knowing how to navigate through that to protect their reputation and to communicate properly is really important. Father Chris, my first question for you is, can you share with the group? I mean, it's always valuable. We all like to put our best foot forward, right? And say, here's all the wonderful things that we're doing. But I think it's particularly honest and open and helpful if someone like you in a position of authority is willing to say, here's a situation that we went through recently where our reputation internally and perhaps externally really was in peril. Here's what worked well and here's what didn't. Do you have an example?
Thanks, Crayton. So part of what we've been doing here at St. Michael has to do with a big transformation of our physical campus. We've been making a lot of changes, and so we've been very aware of how those changes affect our neighbors. We have lots of neighbors who are quite involved politically, and they like to make a lot of noise. And so, as Crayton has mentioned, we have known each other very well personally, but I was also one of Crayton's clients because he runs a PR firm, and Crayton and his company really helped us craft the kind of narrative that we needed to craft in order to tell the right kind of story and to maintain that sort of reputation. We've gone through a few things over these last 9 or 10 years, including applications to the city to rezone our campus, as well as lots of construction work. And every step along the way, we've learned something. And I would say that St. Michael, about 10 years ago, just before I got here, found itself in a bit of trouble because some of the plans that we had made were not made public in a timely way and then were discovered. And because we had not created that narrative, we had not told our story first, then the discovery that was made because of documents and applications that had been sent to the city became kind of a headline that some of the people in the neighborhood who did not wish for us to do the work that we had hoped to do then pointed to something that it was akin to deception. They were able to paint St. Michael as somehow deceptive, and there was nothing deceptive about it. But because we had been keeping our plans to ourselves and not actually bringing in the neighbors as part of that process, even if it's just as information only, then they were able to point the finger at deception. And so I stepped in right after that had happened and was kind of in the middle of the drama, so to speak, that had been created based on that story. And so one of the big things that I learned is that as much as we'd like to be thoughtful and try to really finish an idea well before communicating it to our neighbors or to the people outside the community, we probably need to include them in very intentional ways in that process. Not necessarily ask their opinion, not seek their approval, but at least reveal ourselves, even if we don't think everything is quite tied up and refined the way it should be. And so when I kind of picked up in that process, that's one lesson that I had learned is that even if we're kind of messy and we're not entirely sure what we're going to do, controlling the story is critically important, because if we don't define ourselves, we leave ourselves vulnerable to be defined by someone else. And I think that that's where Crayton stepped in and his team to help us to continue to define ourselves so that even when people heard stuff that they didn't like, that we were going to do something that they didn't want us to do, at least they weren't able to point to us being deceitful or untrustworthy. And we were able to reclaim that high level of trust that a lot of churches lose. I mean, Crayton referenced that right here in Dallas, we've had at least 9 very high level senior pastors of other churches who have had to resign over all different kinds of indiscretions. And that undermines trust for the entire church world. It doesn't matter about denomination. It doesn't matter about affiliation. When the general culture begins to distrust churches, particularly church leaders, because of a few bad apples, then it's even more important for us to own our own identity and define that out in the community as best as possible.
I think you've outlined two really important principles, among others. But one, of course, is this notion of let's not sacrifice the good for the perfect, right?
Yeah.
Church communities often want to be thoughtful, and I mean, the word I kind of joke, those of us in the Episcopal community, we love to use the word discernment, right? That's one of our
Absolutely.
favorite words, and it means so many different things. But we like to be thoughtful, we like to be discerning. But at some point, we're so thoughtful and so discerning to try to get to the perfect, to try to get consensus, to try to make everybody happy, and not ain't everybody going to be happy. And in the meantime, we've missed an opportunity to build trust. This was, where this really, I saw this happen a lot, and maybe you all can relate during COVID, right? There were so many organizations, for-profit, not-profit, religious organizations, that their thinking was, we really don't know what's going on yet. We don't have our arms around this situation, so let's wait. And the problem is that just caused a lot of consternation because their employees were already talking about it. We're already worried. We're already up in arms. And sometimes it's good to say, we're aware of the situation, one. Two, we take this extraordinarily seriously. And then here's the one, this is the tough one. We don't know all of the information, or we don't have all the information yet, but we want to assure you, right, that we are going to be in regular communication. So there's that steady drumbeat of and then it's rinse, wash, repeat. So I imagine you had to do that quite a bit with I mean, even if you felt like you were saying the same thing about your project, you can't assume that everybody reads your email or the one edition of the newsletter or your Facebook post.
Absolutely. Yes. So that's part of what I think we've learned is that, what's the old adage? You have to tell people what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you told them. I think that's minimum. I think you probably really need to say it more like 10 times. And you have to say it in all different formats. So one of the things that really we have helped to define for ourselves when it comes to communication, and Crayton's company really did help with this, is it's got to be a social post and an email and a physical letter and in the bulletin and on the website. It's all has to reflect the same story, and that we have to kind of get deep enough to know what the story is before we go off into specific little tangents. That we have to define that core value, that core identity, and then the small detail things are extensions of that core. But we don't ever undermine what is core. And you said something I think that's really important. I certainly have seen lots of churches wish to create that perfect plan or that perfect message because there is risk in being wrong, or there is risk in being only half informative, or that you have to change as if maybe you weren't thoughtful enough to figure all of this out at the beginning. And the pandemic is a great example of how you just had to jump. You had to do something because everyone around you is hearing those kinds of stories, and everyone around you is able to be thinking of these issues before they hear from you. And if you don't actually step out with some courage, then you really don't have the ability to control that story long term. I mean, Crayton, I'm interested to know if there are examples of best practices that you've seen, particularly within faith communities, because obviously your experience runs the gamut of organizations. But when it comes to organizations that have to build a lot of trust over a long period of time, like churches, are there ways that you have seen people succeed, I guess, or fail, by not actually being able to tell their story well?
Yeah, one of my favorite sayings is, if you don't tell your story, someone else will tell it for you, or worse off, no one will. Right. So, and that last part is really more, I would say, fitting for consumer brands, but to a degree, I think church communities, you're always building trust, and at some, you want folks to keep coming back and to trust the community as a whole. To be honest with you, the ones that seem to be the most successful already have a plan. They have a crisis plan, whether they call it that or not, where they have really developed all of the different scenarios, and they've spent a fair amount of time, clergy as well as their vestry and others. What are all the things that could possibly go wrong, even if they don't even seem palatable, reasonable, or possible right now? What are the things that could happen, and what will our response be? And while the response that you pencil out, the 3 to 5 sentences, may not be exact, they give you a framework. And here's the other piece: they're hopefully already blessed from a legal, no pun intended, from a legal perspective, right? Because having your chancellor on the legal side, and then your PR folks, your comm folks, and I will tell you this: I've often found, and you kind of alluded to this, but I have found that comms people in churches, and not just, this isn't limited to our community, but are not always highly valued.
Mhm.
And not because they don't do a great job with the newsletter, or they don't do a great job with the marketing, but they're not seen as having an expertise. It's really more about marketing as opposed
Well,
to reputation.
or perhaps not core to
Right.
the function. Like it's a nice extra. If you can
Right.
have someone doing that, lovely, but it's not necessary.
Yeah.
And I think that's exactly backwards.
I think that's right. So I'm going to turn your question backwards. I think where I see it going awry the most is in changes in clergy and changes in leadership, right? So that the church has not prepared, or has not thought about, even when they bring a new rector or new clergy on, at some point we're going to have a change. At some point someone's going to leave. And
Yep.
what ends up happening is the rumor mill starts. And I love this term. I refer to it as the bank, the bank of goodwill, the goodwill and the bank of public trust, right? So you either take a withdrawal and you have goodwill to withdraw, or you don't. And hopefully the church has a lot of goodwill, so that when something bad happens, when someone, a beloved member of the clergy, decides to leave, or needs to leave, that the church community and the reputation of leadership can withstand a withdrawal. So that not only happens when you're prepared, but that also that there's a good steady cadence of communication, and usually that means it's tiered, right? So we're gonna start with the vestry. Well, typically the vestry knows. We're going to go to some of our major contributors, right? We're going to then go to, and you level it out, the communication, until you get to the full congregation. And then you're also ready, of course, if someone is forced to go, you also have to be ready, in case the media is interested. It's just not enough to say, "Oh, nothing to see here. Personnel matter. None of your business." We don't get to do that in this day and age, unfortunately. So the trick is being able to say nothing, but making it seem like you've said something. And again, also legal has to bless it. So here's the last thing I'll say, and then we can move along. I think it's also, we have to thread a needle, and I think your example is a perfect one, between when are we oversharing, and when are we undersharing.
Mm.
So I see a lot the draft comments like, the father so and so did nothing illegal, right? Or there was nothing untoward here. Well, you read that as a parishioner and you're like, well, I didn't think there was.
Yeah, you're actually creating the problem.
You're creating a crisis. You're answering a question that wasn't asked,
Yep.
right? And thereby creating a crisis. What we always say is, you never, never, never repeat the negative. Think Richard Nixon if you're of a certain generation. I am not a crook. Think Bill Clinton if you're 20 years younger. I did not have relations with that woman. What did you immediately think? He did have
Of course you
relations with
did.
that woman, and you are a crook. So you never, never, never repeat the negative. On the other hand, in your situation, which I think is a great case study, where you've got a major project, at some point the question is, okay, when's the cat out of the bag? Like
Yeah.
when does everybody, we have to gauge, when does everybody already know, And so we miss an opportunity to be proactive by being the one to share the news. I think those are two different scenarios. Do you see it the same way?
Oh, I do think they're two different scenarios. And I want to kind of take it micro because of course there will be moments in any church's life where a major thing happens. And that major thing could be, say, a huge construction project, or it could be, in the Episcopal Church, hopefully, roles like rectors or deans have long tenures, but then one leaves and you've got to search for a new one. I mean, there are so, kind of major moments, but I think the trust that you referenced being built up, that social capital is often how I refer to it, is built by all the little moments that happen in between. And so as an example of kind of crisis communication, when the pandemic hit, we'll just keep using the pandemic, I realized I wasn't going to see people in person for who knows how long. And so immediately I said, I want to send an email to the congregation. And it was not an email that I did not go out over my skis. I was not talking about medical issues or things I did not know about. I was simply talking about the very tangible, simple things. Can you come to the building? How can you pray at home? Will we be streaming a service? How do you get communion? I mean, it was kind of just nuts and bolts stuff that people care about. And I started sending that email every week. And it was a nice habit, happened for months. Well, when we started coming back, there was a moment where I wondered if I should keep doing that. And we did a little analytics and found that one email was opened more than anything else we sent.
Wow.
Because it was tight. It was not long. It wasn't random meditations. It was kind of like making an ask or communicating a specific detail about whatever was happening that past week, this coming week. That's it. Scope was really finite.
Yep.
And I still send those emails. And they are still now, 4+ years after the pandemic hit, those are still the most opened, most read emails that we send of everything that we send, because it has remained very tight. And I think that what has happened is because I really do think about what I would want to know as a parishioner, not the 10 or 20% that pay really close attention. I'm talking about the 80, 90% who are they just like their church. Yeah. And they show up and that's about as deep as it goes. I want them to know if a bathroom is closed this week, or if there's going to be a special program, or if something fun will happen in the worship service, or whatever that's going to be. And so those letters have become a great way to just say, I see you, and this week, these things are going to be happening. I hope you'll plug in.
Yeah.
I think that micro narrative has both given me a chance to tell our story because I'm able to reiterate the culture setting tone that I want, while also building the trust that when I say a thing's going to happen on a day and a certain time, it does. And so then when I say something big, they already expect that I'm going to tell them the truth because I have been building that trust in very small ways for months and even years.
It's a great best practice for building that social capital or goodwill in the Bank of Public Trust. I want to remind everybody that we're glad to take questions in the chat. So if you have specific things that you'd like to hear from Father Chris or for us to discuss, don't hesitate to let us know. I would like to change gears for a second, and I do want to talk about politics. And I'm curious, how do you handle the election and the political atmosphere, either from the pulpit or in your church? You said, and I've seen that you're gifted at setting the tone. What's your tact?
So this is huge. We could talk about this for hours. I will say my own experience. I came to St. Michael in late summer of 2016. And so I was very new in November of 2016 when we all got I would say, relatively large surprise in the election results. And so I was faced with this new congregation I just didn't know really well. They didn't really know me very well. And I often joke that had I still been in my former parish in Memphis, I would have known exactly what to say. And I would have walked up there, no notes. We would have had a good time. We would have like met the moment with a lot of authenticity because the relationships have been built. Well, these were still new people. We're 3 months in. And so I really had to focus on going deeper than whatever the topic was that week. And so I have said this many times, I will always be indebted to David Brooks, who on election day of 2016, so before any results were in, published an article, one of his op-eds, and the title was, "Let's Not Do This Again." And what he did was he said, regardless of what happens in the election and regardless of your political persuasions, we have mistreated each other and we have not respected the dignity of one another. And that we should not continue. Well, fast forward almost a decade and it's gotten worse. But that stuck in my head. And so one of the things that I have tried to do, one of the lines I've tried to walk in a congregation that I will say is very broad. Lots of Episcopal churches speak of broad tent. I definitely can say that, for example, last week, I had 2 different in-home events at the church hosted by 2 families who are very involved. They love the church. They're very generous with their time and their talent, their treasure, all that stuff. One home I walked into, there is a literal Trump 2024 flag flying by the front door. And the other home has one of those big metal, grates right in the front yard, Harris 2024. So, I mean, I think that just my church really is kind of in that, 50-50, 60-40. I'm not entirely sure. I think it depends on kind of the state of things, but everybody's there to pray together. And they're very clear that they do not agree on a lot of the partisan stuff. And so I say partisan because that's the line I have started to walk, is I say Jesus was very political. So do not come at me saying that politics should not be in church. Of course, Jesus was political. Literally, he was killed by the government. So yes, political, but should not be partisan. And so I've tried to walk that line, which means I've got to go deeper into things that are rooted, say, like in baptismal covenant ideas around dignity, love, care, all of those things that I think the political rhetoric can lose what is that core sense of grace and love and hope that we are supposed to have in our discipleship, and that it doesn't matter some of the partisanship, because the political reality is that we need to be engaged in the world, we need to care about policies, and we need to prioritize feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, all of the things that Jesus spoke of. And then if we wish to diverge in some thoughtful ways around just civil stuff, I got it. That's fine. I'm not going to go there. I do remember there was that one moment where, remind me, is it Pete Sessions who was Attorney General? Is that his name?
Well, his father, right?
Okay. So when he was back in, I don't know, was it 2018 maybe? And he wrote, or he spoke or wrote, I'm not sure, using Romans to defend separating children from their parents at the border when they were trying to come north into the US.
Right.
It's the only time I've ever done a clear op-ed that was explicitly political, because I essentially said, you do not get to use Jesus to hurt people.
Yeah.
And so now if you want to do that and you want to make some political decisions or civil decisions because you think that it matters in some way, you go do what you need to do, but do not essentially come into our lane. Jesus cannot be used to defend hurting people.
Right.
The end. That's how that works.
So what was the fallout in your diverse congregation in a city like Dallas that is diverse? Did you have fallout, and did it matter?
No real fallout, because I do think the line was clear. It kind of was presented as you can be kind to people or you can be a jerk. And so if you're going to choose jerk, then it's pretty clear, like, we don't abide by that. Like, you need to care about other people. I think what often distinguishes my congregation is whether people land on one side of the argument or the other. And I often describe it this way. Do you think that it is enough to not actively hurt? Or do you think that our discipleship calls us to use our gifts to prevent others from hurting people?
Yeah.
And so I think that's kind of the distinction there, because how many times do we hear people think like, well, I didn't do that.
Right.
Well, that's not good enough, in my opinion, but at least that's a starting place. And if we can come together, hold together, which we really have over these last 8 years, which is great, then we get to learn from one another and we can challenge each other, because it's not as if someone along the political spectrum has everything right. Of course they don't. So we have to continue to, in humility, come together and learn. But if we're not physically in the same room, in the same community, having conversations together, then we won't grow.
Well, it seems to me, and I don't mean to oversimplify the matter, but if I'm a priest and I can think of so many biblical principles that partisan politics during election season, I mean, I can only imagine. You're like, golly, I could preach on 18 different things after all the bad behavior I've seen just in the last week alone.
Oh, yes.
Nonetheless, I mean, there are ministers, clergy who decide to preach about one side or the other, or churches that are open to having dialogue in the name of civil discourse.
Yeah.
How? Let me ask it this way: for people who advise clergy, whether they are lay people or staff or even friends, what's the right approach when you're coming to a member of the clergy and saying, that's going to tick a lot of people off, or that's going to make a lot of people uncomfortable, or do you know a half of your congregation doesn't vote that way, and you're connecting partisanship with a biblical principle from the pulpit?
This is so hard, and there is no right. What I would say is that a lot of conversations I have with colleagues, friends from seminary, and those seem to be disconnected from, okay, so I can't tell who's watching this, so sorry if this is offensive, but I do think that I often hear from other priests a disconnect between what they wish to say and do and the consequence. And I think there's this, there seems to be an approach like, if I say the thing I know is right, then I shouldn't get a negative consequence. Or if I say the thing that I know is right, and there is a negative consequence, it's worth the negative consequence. Now, that's totally fine, but the negative consequence actually has a consequence. And so if you don't play out and invest in the kind of consequence your actions take, and you're willing to accept it, then I think that's where the problem comes. So when you want to do a thing that might make a bunch of people angry, and you're willing for them to be angry, but you're not willing for them to leave or to undermine you, then I think you're not quite thinking of it fairly or in a balanced way. There are some times I have said something and I'm like, whatever comes of this, I will take it, because that was worth saying. Like, one example of this, which was so dumb, this is so small, but we had a big freeze here in Texas years back, and there was an entire line of trees down the parking lot on the west side of my campus, and a number of those trees, maybe a third of them, died from the freeze. And we had 3 different arborists come, and we did all of these things, and we kind of looked at it, and then we said we have to take these trees out and replace them. And so we did all of that, and you would have thought that I sacrificed babies on the altar. I mean, it was a hue and cry like I had not heard from anything else. And about 6 weeks later, we had one of our 2 semi-annual parish meetings, and I did my little spiel, and then we got to the Q&A, and I always like people to ask questions from the floor. And then someone asked about the trees, and someone else asked, and then there was almost this moment where there were 5 or 6 people in the room going like, yeah, the trees. And I stopped and I looked at them, and I knew it was coming because I'm really not a patient person. I like to play one as a priest, but there are moments where my patience just is exhausted. And I said, I have been here for years, and every Sunday you come here and you hear about the poor and the vulnerable, people who are victims, who need our help. And we pray for people who are struggling here and all around the world. And we tell their stories and we give opportunities to serve. And not once has there been as big an outcry about children not getting food minutes from our campus, or people who are going homeless and freezing during the winter minutes from our campus. And I listed multiple things. And I said, never once has there been as much anger as has been about these trees.
Yeah.
And I said, until you get your priorities right,
Yeah.
do not mention the trees to me again.
Perspective.
And then I said, any other questions? And there were no other questions. But people have left it alone, and we've had to do more things with the campus. But I think there was a point at which I said, that's enough. But here's the thing. I believe I was right, but I was also committed to taking the hit for having said what I said. And I think that's where a lot of times clergy don't really want to, they're not willing to take the hit.
Yeah.
They want to be able to say what they want to say, but they also don't want to take the hit. And I think you have to be conscious and intentional enough to pick the moments where you say the hard thing and you are willing to take the hit. Because if all you do is say the hard thing, people really won't stick. And then that's where I come in, where I don't consider myself an activist. And so I may push and push on people, but I don't necessarily drop bombs. And the reason I have chosen that kind of behavior is because I actually want people to learn and to grow over time. And if someone gets mad and leaves, I've lost the opportunity for them to actually hear something that challenges what they see in the world and grow because they're gone.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's worth it most of the time.
Yeah. Well, you're humble in your storytelling because the sharp edge of your comment was effective. But what you all joining us should also know that at Chris's behest and because of his leadership, there was also a door-to-door campaign to go to all the neighbors to message and explain, here's what happened, right? So there's a balance between the role of the, in this case, the rector, right, in a moment of leadership versus the other tactics that the church may take on in order to soften the edges. I want to, if you don't mind, tell a brief story. One of the themes of today really is, if you don't tell your story, someone else will do it for you, or no one will. I had a client shortly, well, it was after COVID. He was the first African-born, not African-American, but African-born chairman of the Dallas Regional Chamber. And so we were media training, we was preparing him for everything, and even including racial questions that he would get following the murder of George Floyd. And he said to me, Crayton, I want you to list every question I could possibly get. Like he said, there must be 100, 150 questions that I could get. And I want you to list them all and give me prepared answers. And I said, well, John, first of all, that's going to be, I'll do it, but it's a waste of my time and your money because there's only 5 answers, right? And my point was there for any given topic, there's only 3 to 5 answers. You've got to stick to your narrative. So fast forward, we worked with recently a private parochial school that right after October 7th of last year, This particular school is in the heart of Dallas near a very prominent and strong Jewish community. And so members of the local synagogue and that community put up missing posters of some of the children that had been kidnapped on October 7th of 2023. The very good intentioned leaders of the DEI team at this school saw that those posters were on, public posts, utility posts, right outside of the carpool driveway where children leaving the school would see those posters. So they decided in that moment to take the posters down. Now you can imagine the outcry, and we've heard it nationally from members of the Jewish community who have just been astonished at what it has meant to take things down like that. So the school responded very quickly in order to say how much we love the Jewish community, we abhor the actions of October 7th, and condemn Hamas. Well, that same neighborhood also has a very strong Palestinian community.
Oh, geez.
So then what happened? The school sends out another letter, and says, essentially, we love our Palestinian neighbors. You're very important. So I'm exaggerating a little bit, but what ensued was months and months of ping-ponging. We love you more. Oh, no, sorry, we didn't mean to love on them too much. We love you more.
Yeah.
And had they just stuck to the narrative, like, we're a community that embraces all faiths and all people. This is the mission of our school. Usually, if you just every organization already has a mission statement, right? Whether it's your particular parishes or something that's larger, and if we just will stick to that in the instances where we have to say something, as opposed to we course correcting, you end up getting yourself deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. Because remember, there's only 5 answers, and what we mean by that is it's a topic. And so no matter what you're asked, you got to go back to your key messages.
Crayton, I'd love for you to maybe speak to an idea that I have often used in my own communication, and I don't know if it's a really good idea. And that is essentially, I am prepared for at least a small percentage, 5, 8, 10 so percent of people to never like what I say, and to never agree with what I say, or to not like me. And I kind of use that metric as my yardstick. So long as I don't hear more than about 5 or 10% of negativity, I just press on, because I figure if I can get 90%, I am totally winning. Like that is great. And I wonder if that's appropriate, because I often see that colleagues or churches in general really wish to make everyone happy. I mean, genuine to their core. And it comes from such a good place where they want everyone to feel loved, affirmed, and, satisfied. Happy is a little cheap, but somehow reach unanimity. And I don't often ever think that's even possible. So we may do a whole, like you said, we've canvassed our neighbors, and we do things like deliver cookies and bread and thank you notes and letters to let them know we're doing things, or all of that stuff. We still do it. And we will always get a couple of neighbors who will call angry and all the things, but it's usually maybe 1 or 2.
Yeah.
And so I think so long as it's 1 or 2, that's a win. No
Yeah.
problem. I don't think anything of it.
It's pretty difficult, no matter who your audience is, to please everybody all the time. And that's usually the number one question communicators or people who are interested about reputation should be asking. And by the way, that should be clergy too, right? But the question is, who is our audience? Who are we trying to reach here? And then what's the goal? Is your metric as the leader, okay, I want everybody to love me? Or is your metric, I want everybody to feel like they belong here?
Mm.
And I think the latter, and again, this is coming from a layperson who's a communications guy, right? So, I mean, that's easy for me to say and easy for me to judge, a member of the clergy who is self-aware enough to say, yeah, it's a popularity contest. I want everybody to be here because they love me. Let's be honest. People come and go. The speed of the leader is the speed of the gang. People come and go based on who's in the pulpit. That's just a reality. But I think as you approach your communications plan and the things that you say and the things that you do, having an acknowledgement that we're not going to please everybody all the time. And I think the one thing certainly the church communities have that not all corporate or nonprofit organizations have is a very clear set of principles, right? That
Yeah.
are that are right there and that are easy to follow. So is it any church community that I would advise from a communications perspective, if they said to me, we really don't care what people think. We're just interested in doing the right thing and interested in what Jesus would do and interested in what the Bible tells us to do. My response would be, I think that's wonderful, but I don't think it's that simple because I think no pun intended, the devil's in the details, and how you practice that really will determine whether people feel like they belong there or not, or whether you're just, again, no pun intended, lofting up on high with the collar saying, I know best, just do what I say. And it just isn't that simple. I want to let you react to that if you want to, but we've got a couple questions in the chat also. So
No, go ahead. Let's do the chat.
okay.
I don't lose
All right.
time.
We've got a couple here. So let me get to the first one before I lose it. All right, here we go. If the ministers of the church represent Jesus and what he taught, not Paul and his speculations, with the intent of a therapeutic and redemptive outlook which characterizes dealings with individuals, doesn't it make sense to speak with one voice? If God's law reflects trust, then there are certain things that you say with one voice. You do not lie. I suggest that withholding certain aspects of the truth is still a lie. What do you say to that from a reputation communications perspective?
I think this actually, you just answered this before you
Kinda
went to
did.
the comment. You did, because I think that there's to think that we know the truth is to think too highly of ourselves. I think that we can know some truth, and I think that we can do the very best we can in the moment. But I think that the idea that we know the whole thing then sets us up for general conflict. I mean, you said something a minute ago that I kind of, smiled at, which is if someone were to tell me we're going to do what the Bible says, and then you would say, well, anyone who's ever studied the Bible knows that you can say whatever you want from the Bible. I mean, you can go pick a half verse out of anything and defend any kind of position. So it's not as simple, as you said, just simply saying we're going to do what the Bible says, because being Episcopalian allows us to say, my gosh, there has to be a ton of nuance. And you've got to create context, and you've got to have historical significance. And then you've got to understand that, are you basing this on English? Because it was not written in English. And so there are all these different layers to having a perspective of like, do what the Bible says. Similarly, the idea that like we know the truth, and if we don't own the truth, then we're somehow lying, I think is just a little too simple, because there is complexity. And that complexity, I mean, Crayton is a person who is always going to church. I mean, committed and invested. And so he may say layperson here, but hear him as a person who has made this as integral to his life as anyone who might wear a collar. And so to actually get multiple people in a space who are all genuinely seeking to be faithful and wrestling with these ideas and what the truth actually is, that's what makes us Anglican, is that actually we discern truth in community. And so for any one person to ever claim it, I mean, I teach in my Bible studies that if any one person ever tells you they know exactly what is the mind of God, then they for sure do not.
Run
And
the other
so
way.
do not listen to them. And so that's it. I mean, you said discernment right off the bat in this session. And I think that we can often lean on that as a crutch to keep us from actually doing anything. But I think the spirit of when we come together, when two or three or more are gathered, that's actually when we discern this. And we have to remain open to the Spirit working in us and through our group in order to continue to learn and discover what God's really calling us into.
So as we close here with about 8 minutes left to go, Father Chris, I'm from a reputation perspective, with all the things happening in the world, elections, church scandals, social media. From a reputation perspective, what keeps you up at night as the leader of one of the largest Episcopal parishes in Texas?
Well, I would love to say something keeps me up at night, but I've never actually had things keep me up at night, which
Good
my
for
wife
you.
is really jealous of. But what you are asking, I would say that people losing hope is what probably sticks in my mind most. And as I prepare sermons or Bible studies or teachings of some kind, I am pretty much ever present focused on how to keep people mindful of hope. Because we can say a lot of things about Christianity. We can say a lot of things about Jesus, a lot of things about God, a lot of things about church history, theology, all those things. But right now in our world, I think that it is most critical that we keep ourselves anchored in the very basic hope that tomorrow can be better than today, that the hope that we actually have the capacity to affect positive change, to make the world better, the hope that God has put in us that responsibility to do the work. And I think that when people lose hope, then it becomes so much harder for us as a church to make the impact that we really seek to make. And so, yes, there are all kinds of details that we should address, details we should consider, details we should acknowledge. But if we are not reminding people every time that we speak or write or tell our story that there is hope, then I think we're missing a real opportunity. And we see that in functional ways. So, like we've acknowledged, we're doing a big building project. Well, I know all the data that says if a church does a building project, you're looking at least a 30% bump in attendance when things are done. And why? It's not because people like shiny stuff. It's because when a church or any organization invests in a big way in their future, what they are doing is they are planting a flag really firmly to say we believe the best is yet to come, that we believe the future can actually be better than the past. And so few organizations are unashamedly claiming that hopefulness that when one does, people respond in pretty powerful ways.
That's helpful. I'll leave you all with just 4 takeaways, things to remember, perhaps from a communications perspective. First, and this is hard sometimes for churches, and that is a sense of humility, especially when things aren't going well. I had a client, not a religious organization, but a quasi-governmental organization that was going through a city audit. And the city auditor found some irregularities, and in particular found that the leader of this particular organization had bought an expensive piece of luggage that he had expensed, later paid back, but had expensed. So this piece of luggage ends up becoming like the headline issue. And I tell you this story because this often happens with church leadership. Also, there's something little that creates distrust and becomes the moniker, becomes what everybody remembers. So they asked me to come help. I had been on their board previously. We go into executive session and they are mad. They are angry. They feel like this is unfair, the city is unfair, the media has been unfair, this is wrong, and we need to right the wrong. We need to correct the record. So I let them vent for a while. And finally, I said, look, here's my question. Do you want to be right or do you want to win? Do you want justice or do you want to win? Because what was about to happen is the city council was about to revoke their contract and to vote them down. And I said, look, I will message you all day long on how this piece of luggage was a legitimate business expense and got paid back, but you're going to lose. You're going to lose trust and you're going to lose your contract. So where does that translate to us in a church community? We have to be humble and acknowledge that when things go wrong, we may not always be able to correct the record. We might have to take our lumps, which second goes to, you got to have a plan. And you have to anticipate, we talked about this at the beginning, all the things that could possibly go wrong. It's hard to do negative, we like to be glasses half full, and especially when we're at church or involved with our church, but we have to do the worst case scenario thinking. Third is to communicate early and often. And I love your example earlier in our conversation, Chris, about your weekly emails. So it goes back to, even if you have nothing to say, there's something to say. And it's just these little incremental updates, and that builds goodwill in the bank of public trust, not for if something bad happens, but when it happens, you can afford a withdrawal. Now, that doesn't mean to over communicate on the things that don't need to be said, or to answer the negative, or to insert a negative idea that wasn't there to begin with and inadvertently cause a crisis by communicating too much, but it does mean keeping people updated. And finally, and this one is so important, we haven't talked about this today, but I think it's a biblical principle. When you screw up, say I'm sorry. It is amazing how you can take the sword out of the hand of the reporter, the attacker, the naysayer, or even the one whose feelings got hurt. And this goes back to point number one. Even if you don't feel like it's right or just because you want justice and to be heard and to be understood, sometimes saying I'm sorry is just the right thing to do and makes the reputational communications crisis go away. Father Chris, you get the last word.
I love all four of those, Crayton, and really appreciate the thoughtfulness, because I think that most of the people on this call can probably talk to a priest very easily, but they cannot talk to a PR pro like you. And so I think hearing your perspectives are really, really helpful. And I just want to reiterate the apology. It is so easy to let people have a gracious out. If you just apologize, I mean, I apologize for stuff I did not have anything to do with, because it's still so powerful. Just saying the words disarm everything, and it allows people to calm down. And I often like to say in moments of crisis to the person I'm talking with, do you really want to say what you're saying? Do you really want to be the person that you are being right now? And 9 times out of 10, people take a breath and they say no, because we know that we can get wrapped up in the wave of drama. And I think your point to go in with humility, say an apology, just levels everything and reminds us of our humanity in the very best sense. And I bet more often than not, and probably most of the time, it will actually really heal whatever kind of crisis you're in.
Y'all could see why Father Chris is one of my favorite people, why we could talk for hours, and why when we get together for lunch or coffee or in the driveway, they're some of my favorite moments. So I would be remiss if I didn't say to check out episcopalparishes.org if you're not currently a member of the Episcopal Parish Network. It's 3:00 Central Time. It's been such an honor to be with all of you today. My name is Crayton Webb of Sunwest Communications in Dallas, Texas, and it's been my pleasure to be with the Reverend Dr. Chris Girata from St. Michael and All Angels, also in Dallas. And we wish you all a wonderful afternoon, and how about a peaceful election season? How about that?
I would love that. Thank you, Crayton.
Thank you all. Great to see
you all.
Thank you.